Welcome everyone to today's flipped learning lesson. If you are here, you've chosen to work on your verb tenses. The goal of the lesson today is to help you understand how to choose the proper verb, use the proper verb tense, and remain consistent with verb tenses throughout your writing. It's really important that you stay consistent with your tenses in order not to lose points. The materials that you'll need today are a pen or a pencil, your verb tenses worksheet, which can be found in the folder, a notebook if you'd like to take your own notes, and the piece of writing that you'll be working on, either on a Chromebook or you can have a hard paper copy. Verb tenses help to express the time when an action is described by the verb that takes place. There are three major tenses that you'll be using most likely in your writing, which are past, present, and future. You can see the little box there that gives you some definitions, but we'll talk about them a little bit more. Past tense is a tense that shows that the actions or events took place in a time before today, so in the past, just like the word. So some examples would be lived, went, was, did, played. You'll notice that some of them have that ed suffix that helps you to understand that they're in the past. The present tense talks about the actions that are taking place now, so in the current time. So an example would be is, or lives, goes, does, play. So a lot of times that they'll end in S, but they don't always have to end in S. It depends on how you're using them. And then finally, we have the future tense, which is a tense that's showing that the actions will take place later, after the current time. So your examples will include the word will be, will live, will go, etc. So let's look at some examples and see if we can figure out which tense that is being used in these examples. So the first one, what time will I have to be at school before I'll be marked late? What do you think? We'll reveal the answers in a moment. It was a big mistake that I asked John to go to the store for groceries because he came home with just junk food and no ingredients for dinner. I know it probably sounds like your dream, but not so good. The next example is, I cannot believe that it is getting dark before 5 p.m. now. So let's reveal the answers and see how you did. The first example is future. Notice that there's a helping verb will. This will often appear to indicate a future tense. The next example was past tense. So oftentimes you'll notice that the verbs end in ed, but there are so many irregular verbs that you do not want to get attached to this idea. You can't depend on it. And then finally, we have the present tense. We had the word now, which helped us to indicate that the time was now in the current time, but would you still have been able to tell that it was present without that word? And what word helps us use that? I think that word is will help us, even if the word now is not there. So how do we choose the right verb tense? Choosing a tense at the beginning of your piece of writing and remaining consistent helps to establish the context of your work. So it can help you with your setting, your character choices, and even the overall plot of your story. Also, keeping your tenses consistent helps your piece to be coherent and clear to the readers. Also clean, I'm sure. They'll always understand when your writing is taking place. It can be very confusing when people flip-flop, because they don't know if it's past, present, or future, and then that can be really, really confusing for the reader. Finally, unnecessary or inconsistent shifts in verb tense can cause confusion. So there's a resource here. I'm not going to require that you go to it, but if you're really curious on how to be even more consistent, there's a great resource below that you can click on right there. And remember, this is one time that things are a little bit different. You want to shift sometimes in your story from the present tense to either the future or the past. So when it is appropriate, you are allowed to do that shifting of tenses, but it should be very clear to the reader. So one time it's available is when you are writing with a flashback to recall past events. That tense would shift from present to past. And then finally, if you're using the technique of foreshadowing, the tense should also shift, most likely from the present tense to the future tense. Just make sure that these are brief and that you always come back to the tense that you're originally writing in, and that you're not just going into the past and staying there. that makes it ineffective.
So you just went through the three major tenses with Miss Connolly: past, present, and future. We're going to talk about two tenses that are a little bit less commonly used, but when used correctly can be really effective. The first one is the present perfect tense. This tense is used to describe events that began in the past that can be either finished or unfinished events. To form the present perfect tense, you use have or has plus the past participle. So not the past tense, but the past participle. Make the past participle by adding ed to regular verbs. For example, play becomes played. So you would say have played or has played. Irregular verbs change the spelling to the past participle. So go becomes gone. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see some examples of when it's appropriate to use the present perfect tense. There are some examples of unfinished events, like how long something has been going on. So, for example, I've known Karen since 1994. She's lived in London for 3 years. You've known Karen for that long, but you still continue to know her. And then you can see that there are some finished events down below. If you want to look at that further, you can look at the example that's on your sheet. Now we're going to look at some examples in action. So this sentence says, Janet has run 2 miles. So you can see the form of has plus the past participle of run. This is the present perfect tense. In this example, Janet is still running when the words were spoken. Another example, David has worked alongside 2 of the world's finest scientists in the field of entomology. This is, again, present perfect, because in this example, David might have finished working with those scientists, but the sentence carries the connotation that he is still working as an entomologist. And lastly, the board has decided to uphold the appeal. The connotation here is that the board continues to uphold whatever appeal they did at the time the sentence was spoken. Oh, one more. I have taken the wrong path again. So the connotation here is that I took the wrong path, but I am still on the wrong path. So you say I have taken the path because it's an unfinished event. Tip, don't try to force yourself to write with present perfect tenses, verb tenses. If it occurs naturally, just be sure to proofread that you're using the correct form of the verb, like on the previous slide, with the has plus the past participle. Another verb tense that we're going to talk about is the past perfect tense. So very similar to the present perfect, but you use this tense to emphasize an action that was completed before another event took place. So this is to try to help establish some time and sequence in your writing. So to form this tense, you use the simple of have, which is had. That's what makes it the past perfect tense. And then you use the past participle, like we mentioned before, usually made by adding an ed to the infinitive, but some verbs have irregular past participles. Again, you can see on the left-hand side this time that this can you can use this to describe actions that finished before another past action, how long a point in the past happened, or unreal things that happened in the past. Some examples. Silverfinger had taken the pill before the team reached him. You can see in the explanation underneath, first he took the pill, next the team reached him. I had called the police before I investigated the noise in the garden. First, I called the police. Next, I investigated the noise. So you can see that this tense is being used to sort of sequence events. The weather changed, but the team had planned its next move. First, the team planned. Next, the weather changed. And lastly, we want to plan a trip for my grandparents, but they had recently gone to Hawaii to celebrate their 50th anniversary. First, the grandparents, went on the trip. Next, we wanted to plan a trip for them. So this tense is used to just kind of help establish when events take place. It's pretty common for students to misuse had and add extra hads into their writing when they don't need to. Just remember, as we mentioned earlier, you can use this tense, but you want to proofread and make sure that you're using it for the right reason. For more practice with all of the verb forms, you should visit the site perfectenglishgrammar.com. The link is here and then also on your sheet. This is a great way to ensure that you are using the right forms of all the verb tenses.
So now what we're going to do is we're going to practice these skills on a real life excerpt. This one happens to be from the first book of the Harry Potter series, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And if you'd like to highlight all of the verbs while I'm reading the excerpt, that might be a good idea. You just want to make sure that you highlight any verbs that indicate time, including the helping verbs. Nearly 10 years had passed since the Dursleys had woken up to find their nephew on the front step, but Privet Drive had hardly changed at all. The sun rose on the same tidy front gardens and lights up the brass number 4 on the Dursleys' front door. It crept into their living room, which was almost exactly the same as it had been on the night when Mr. Dursley had seen the fateful news report about the owls. Only the photographs on the mantelpiece really show how much time has passed. 10 years ago, there had been lots of pictures of what looked like a large pink beach ball wearing a different colored bonnets. But Dudley Dursley was no longer a baby. And now the photographs showed a large blonde boy riding his first bicycle on a carousel at the fair, playing a computer game with his father, being hugged and kissed by his mother. The room will hold no sign at all that another boy lived in this house too. So now what I'd like for you to do is go back and reread the excerpt to make sure you didn't miss any of the verbs, including the helping verbs. So you want to make sure anything that indicates time is highlighted. You have a hard copy of this worksheet in the Verb Tenses folder of the flipped lessons, which you should have already grabbed. If you haven't done that, I'm going to have you do that now. And here comes the reading again. This is a great time to pause the video and take your time to make sure you didn't miss anything while I was reading.
So now that you've had a chance to read it yourself and highlight the verbs, were you able to tell which tense the majority of the text is written in? It's a little confusing if you notice that some of the verbs are inconsistent. So for example, in the sentence here, the sun rose on the same tidy front gardens and lights up the brass number 4. This is confusing because you see we have had passed up here, had hardly changed, rose past tense, and now suddenly we have a present tense verb. Again, down here, only the photographs on the mantelpiece really show how much time had passed. This is a little bit confusing. It should probably be showed how much time had passed. And then in the last sentence, the room will hold no sign. Suddenly it's inconsistent. It jumps to future tense here when that doesn't appear anywhere else in the paragraph. So you would probably write something like the room held no sign at all that another boy lived in the house too. Now we're going to practice. Choose a tense and try to stick with it. So you're going to read the paragraph to yourself again and change all the tenses to be a consistent past tense. So go through and make sure that all of the verbs are consistently past tense. And then try it again with a consistent present tense. You want to pause the video and stop here and do that with all the verbs. Now that you've had a chance to play with the tenses a little bit, you want to stop and consider. Which of these two tenses stood out to you as a reader, the past or the present? Which tense made you feel more connected to the narrator's experiences, and why? These are some things that you want to consider as a writer, depending on what type of piece you are writing. If you're writing a memoir, something that happened in the past tense, you want to try to remain consistent with your past tense so that the reader feels like these things happened a long time ago. Okay, so now you're going to go back into your own writing and do the following after having learned all about different verb tenses. First, you're going to highlight all of the verbs in your writing. Don't forget those helping verbs. Secondly, you're going to fix any inconsistencies that you find in your verb tenses. Thirdly, you're going to consider how you feel about the verb tenses that you've chosen once you've remained consistent with them.
So the next thing that you're going to do as a writer, you're going to decide which time is most appropriate to set your writing in and which tense you want to use for your writing. You should also be able to explain why this is the best choice for your piece in case your instructor asks. Then the last thing that you want to do is you might want to experiment a little and try changing your tenses to reflect a different time, past to the present, present to the future, or present to the past, and think about what you might gain or lose by changing the tense. Does it make more sense written one particular way? Once you've made that evaluation, then you're on your way to a great narrative.